Consensus building at the recently concluded G20 summit in New Delhi wasn't just restricted to addressing geopolitical realities or hard calls on climate action. In a first under India's presidency, the G20 welcomed its newest engagement group called Startup-20. Catalyst of innovation-driven growth, job creation and economic recovery, the G20 startup ecosystem was given its own table, and rightly so. Home to over 850,000 startups and more than 1,500 unicorns combined, the G20 nations form the world's new economy powerhouse. But the proverbial valley of death with a high chance of mortality rate remains a reality for startups, and the ongoing funding winter is an example of how young companies need support to survive through tough economic conditions. And so unlocking startup finance emerged as a key priority, and the New Delhi declaration has set an audacious target of raising the G20 investment in the global startup ecosystem to $1 trillion by 2030. But funding is only one of the challenges that young founders face in the globalized world today. The Startup-20 Comminuque, crafted by India with representatives of other G20 nations, clearly states there is very little harmonization in terms of policy framework, regulatory legacy and market maturity within the group. Problems with domicile, taxation, cross-border listings and investments. The list is long and complex, by cyborgy artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency. Having said that, I must appreciate India's push to help startups with a corporate governance framework to create a sound foundation for enduring businesses. Hello and welcome to Young Turks, India's longest running show on startups and entrepreneurship. I'm Shereen Bhan, and joining me on the program today to take the discussion forward, Chintan, Vaishnav, the chair of the Startup-20, an engagement group under India's G20 presidency aimed to strengthen the startup ecosystem. Chintan is also mission director at the Atal Innovation Mission. We also have with us Rajat and Anandan, managing director at Peak 15 Partners, and Debjani, Ghosh, president of NASSCOM. Debjani, gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18. Chintan, let me start by talking to you about the implications, the impact and the significance of the G20 Startup Engagement Group. Through the year, there have been several meetings, starting with the meeting in January that took place in Hyderabad, and then you had meetings in Sikkim, you had meetings in Goa, in, of course, Haryana, Bangalore, and putting together this global startup framework, which is now part of the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration. The implications of this.
So, as you know, structure drives behavior, right? And what this inclusion of the Startup-20 group into the G20 architecture does is it changes the structure forever, so to say. Until now, there used to be only one group that represented businesses on the private side of the G20 architecture, namely the Business 20, the B20 group. But much of what discussed was about large corporations. This is the first time we've created a structure that will endure and represent the SMEs and the startups, which are the small, nimble, innovative, agile. So this is in that sense, a significant departure from the past.
At a practical level, what will this come down to, Rajat?
Yeah, thank you, Shereen, for having us. It's great that you're covering this as part of Young Turks. So, Shereen, I think, look, basically what this will hopefully do is create sort of a much higher level of awareness, appreciation, and also commitment from every government in the G20, in each of the G20 nations, right, to focus on startups. India is the third largest startup ecosystem, as we know, and actually the Indian government has been very focused on startups over the last 7-8 years. But that is not the case with most of the G20 countries. In fact, one of the most interesting pieces of data that we looked at was startup funding in each of the G20 countries compared to their respective GDPs, right? And the funding, the annual funding in startups, just as one data point, varied from 0.1% through over 1%. There was only one country in the world where startup funding as a percentage of GDP is over 1% for more than 1 year, and that was the US, where consistently for many years, they've been funding their startup innovation ecosystems, right? So there's a dramatic variation, and I think a large part of that is because there's still a lack of understanding of how important startups are to driving innovation, which over time leads to better livelihoods, to better employment, to more investments, and so on and so forth. So I think the single biggest thing this will do, again, as Chintan mentioned, this is the beginning of the journey. We're very fortunate that Brazil, which takes over the presidency for India, will continue this, will over, I think, several years, will create a much higher sense of urgency, a much higher level of awareness of the importance of startups to every single nation in the G20, and over time, obviously, every nation around the world, of how important it is to cultivate a vibrant startup ecosystem. And in India, for instance, 1% would, basically by 2030, by the way, the number is, it's 1% of GDP going into startup funding in every nation by 2030, right? So, and that number works out to $1 trillion per year in startup funding by 2030. And in India, that number would work out to about $50 billion per year, by 2030. So these are very material, and that's about a 3x increase from where we are in 2023. So if you look at where global startup funding, Shereen, will end up this year, we'll end up at about 350 billion, which is roughly where we were before we saw the big exuberant spike in 2021 and early 2022. So we are pretty much, what we'd like to see across the G20 nations is go from 350 billion ideally to about $1 trillion by the end of the decade.
Lack of capital, access to capital is just one of the many challenges that the startup ecosystem faces. But we are talking about a global economy, an integrated economy, alliances, collaboration, partnerships. That's going to be crucial. What's been the big learning, the big takeaway on that front, Debjani?
Yeah, Shereen, before I answer that, just a quick one. Before we even started work on the preparing for the S20 summit and deliberations, Chintan had actually got a few of us together to just think through what do we want as the key outcome of the summit. Of course, we wanted continuity. We wanted Brazil and whoever next to keep keeping this focus alive. But I think the key thing we wanted to do as a group was ensure that every single government realizes that startups today are no more good to have, but they're a must-have for countries from an economic development perspective. Because if you can change that narrative and if you can make startups, if you can make governments realize the importance of startups as its engines of economic growth, and I'm so glad that the leaders' deliberation actually called out, they used those words. I think that was key, and I think kudos to the entire team. I think that was achieved to a very large extent. And, the Alliance Group was looking at, when we started this, just the definition of startup. Every country had a different definition, for example. And of course, the processes, but there was so much of good to learn from each other. So I think the first thing about the Alliances Group was just bringing together the best known practices that exist across countries to understand what works, what doesn't work, and then start looking at what are those key areas where working together we can achieve a lot more. For example, fueling global innovation for the SDG goals. If we can work together, and the process and the thought process was to create a global innovation network, if we can work together to mentor, to provide support, funding for startups that are working towards solving for the SDG goals, we can achieve a lot more than each of the countries individually. Creating global mentor alliances, networks, right? That is so critical. Market access, working together to create market access within G20, right? So we had identified a few of these areas which we worked with all the participating countries to see how we could create these alliances to just make it easier for startups to innovate and also build sustainable businesses.
Yeah, and I think that is going to be crucial, as you pointed out. There is a lot of emphasis on being able to support businesses that help in achieving those sustainable development goals that you spoke of. There are recommendations on how support can be provided. But Chintan, let's talk about the governance framework, because through the course of the engagements that you had, and I know that the G20 India Sherpa Amitabh Kant also stressed on the need and the importance of a governance framework when we talk about the startup ecosystem. Yes, innovation is important, but we also wanted to create clean, sustainable businesses at the end of it. So, Chintan, the emphasis on that and the outcome at the end of this exercise to take that forward.
Oh, certainly. Srini, let me link it back to the alliances question that you asked. See, the alliance challenge was external, so looking at the globe, but it was also internal because we're constantly trying to integrate our own innovation ecosystem. And I think one of the things that we did, which had some very unexpected outcomes, and that comes to your point about governance, was when we had a draft communique, we had put it out for public consultation. There were close to about 40 plus sort of gatherings of startups and ecosystem actors within India to discuss this, opine on it, send us feedback, and so on. One such gathering came back to us and said that, look, startup ecosystems will never realize their full potential until the point when startups stand up and say that they're serious about governance. Their analogy was that if you look at India's IT sector, it was not only because of the young people and the IT prowess that we have turned it into a global services sector. It is because we told the world that we are serious about governance. Their IP and their work will not be lost here. We have generated that trust, and that same type of trust startup ecosystem needs to generate in investors. And that led to a very quick set of activities which brought together people again. And that discussion generated this startup governance framework, which we quickly integrated into Startup-20's work. So this was really unexpected from people, stakeholders, turning into something that's globally useful. And the idea there was simple, that just because you are new, small, and innovative as a startup, that doesn't really mean governance can be an afterthought. Governance needs to be on your mind, the get-go. And the framework then went on to say, if you're an early stage, what can you do internally to startups, to a startup, to document the things that you will need for good governance? If you're mid-stage, how do you put together a board, have some kind of processes and rules around how you implement good governance? And then if you are larger and at the IPO stage, how do you begin to look similar to a corporate governance type of a more mature structure? So it created this ladder. The idea now is to take this ladder and really sensitize the system, not only ours, but other nations can do it as well. But in our case, what we have done, for instance, is that IDEX, the Innovation in Defense Excellence, we're discussing that incubators that get IDEX funding ought to implement good governance practices through the startups. We will do that with our Innovation Mission and so on, because it's good for everybody.